In this video, we're going to be going over some more advanced UV techniques as they pertain to real-time asset creation for use in a video game engine. There are a few concepts that we're going to really be covering, and then we're going to go look at some specific tools for Maya 2018, and then I might show a workflow or two to get you started on just seeing how somebody UVs. So the first thing we're going to talk about is Texel Density. That's the name of the game, really, whenever we're trying to UV our models. Basically, it's making sure that we have enough pixels on our model to describe the texture accurately. And the way we do that is by maximizing the size of our UV islands and filling up as much space in our UV editor. So to see what I'm talking about, I'm going to do something. I'm going to change my workspace up here in the top right corner. I'm going to change that workspace to UV editing. And that's going to bring up our UV editor, and it's going to kind of push our scene view over here. I want to go ahead and open up my outliner and also have that visible as well, just for ease of use in the scene navigation. So let's talk about Texel Density a little bit more now that we can see what's going on in our UV editor. Basically, whenever we look at these UV islands, we basically get a 2D representation of our 3D model. And in this one square space, we try to pack all of the UV islands that we've projected off our model into this space. We try to make the islands as big as possible. Let's say, for instance, we made a texture that was 2048 pixels tall and wide with the power of 2. Then we can say that there's going to be 2,000 pixels that are going to travel across here, and then 2,000 pixels down. So we have a limited number of pixels to work with, a finite amount. So it stands to reason that the bigger the islands, the more texels or the more pixels are going to be applied to the model. So with that concept in mind, it's very important to make sure that you are UVing with that in mind, because you don't want to have your textures at low resolution. We want to maximize the number of pixels we can pack on there. And if I turn on my checkerboard right here, we can see a quick checkerboard wrapped around my sword right here, and I'm going to show us an example of how UV island size affects how many squares we can pack on to this model. Because the more squares, basically, the more detail we can put on the island, right? So as we increase, let me look on this side. I got this side selected. As we increase the size, we can see that we're packing more and more squares into that space. And that's going to give us more resolution to work with. It's going to create higher quality models. So Texel Density is the name of the game, and there's going to be a few tools that we can use to make sure that our texel densities are right for each specific piece of the model here. But like with all of 3D modeling and asset creation, it's very subjective as to what exactly we're trying to accomplish with each model. So let's talk about another concept, the visibility of the asset in the game. Let's use this little orc as an example from Dota 2. In the game that he's ripped from, I downloaded him from the Dota 2 workshop, where you can go in and create your own meshes and stuff for the characters and sell them on the store. The perspective that people view this game asset is from an isometric bird's eye view. It's not kind of like a Fallout or Wasteland isometric RPG like a Baldur's Gate. It's kind of like a real-time strategy. So it's kind of far up into the sky here. Just by this perspective, we can see that the upper body and the top of the head and the top of the shoulders are really the only visible things that we can see. Of course, you can see the legs, but they don't get much consideration. You can see that the detail down here isn't that inspiring. In fact, You can even see some of the resolution just beginning to get real blurry down towards the bottom, because we're not really going to see those feet too much. But yet, when we look at the face, we don't see as much low resolution stuff. Compare the details on the face to the foot. It's subtle, but the differences are there. If our character was in a third-person shooter, what do you think would probably need to have the most attention? The upper body, the back, the shoulders, the triceps, back of the head, stuff like that. So we know that we'll need to spend a little extra attention on this part of the model. And remember, our texel density dictates that the bigger the UV islands, the more pixels we can pack on there. So it stands to reason if I select this dude, we can see something like the shell for the head being really huge, while the shell for the feet being relatively smaller. So you can see how they split that up. And if we turn on our checkerboard here, we can see smaller squares right here, while we have them a little bit bigger down here. And you'll notice there's a little bit of distortion on the island checks. That's because this is an organic model. You don't quite get perfect checkerboards on organic models. We'll talk about that more in a second. So the visibility of the asset in the game is going to dictate how big your UV islands will be for each part of the character, because we want to be able to put more pixels where the player sees the character more often. Distortion, we just mentioned that a little bit. We saw a little bit of distortion working up here. These aren't exactly rectangles, and even when we do have more square looks, they're kind of warped or kind of crooked and jagged. That is natural distortion that happens when you try to take a 3D object with volume and smash it down onto something flat. It's a little bit easier to do that with examples like these squares right here, these blocks. I want to make this a little bit bigger. So why don't we look at these three cubes as examples for distortion and how we can UV map them better to just cut out on distortion while also making the texturing process a little bit easier. So if we select the worst offender, we notice we only have two UV islands or two UV shells. We have the bottom piece right here and then the top piece right here. Perfect. The fewer the islands, the better. Our vertex counts and all of that are happier with fewer islands. But we notice something right here. We notice that something looks a little fishy with the way that this rectangle is not quite on center and all that stuff. This is basically, after I made my UV seams and unfolded it, this is what Maya came up with. And the same thing's happening here with kind of the organic thing. We don't have an easy way to collapse this lid, this top part of the box with the top part and the sides. We don't have a reliable way to smush that down flat. So we get distortion. You can see the distortion here. The top looks fine, the bottom looks fine, but the sides are distorted and jagged. Let's look at another example. All right. Here we have all of our islands separated. Okay. That looks pretty good. Nothing's crooked or jagged. And then if we turn on our texture previewer or our checkerboard previewer, we can see that, hey, great, look, everything looks like a perfect square. This was laid out really nicely. But we start running into an issue here, and that is texture seams. If you were trying to paint a detail, like a strap that kind of goes over this box right here, then you would try to have to match up exactly where on this UV island here you would have to paint that detail. And you'd be painting a strap from here, and then we can also see that the same edge is over here. You'd have to paint it over there. So whenever we have a bunch of UV seams, it can get a little inconvenient for some hand worked texture stuff. Some hand painted textures or just a quick, lo-fi texture for a small low poly asset. These days, a lot of texturing suites, they allow you to paint directly on a 3D model. So texture seams aren't as big as an issue as they used to be. But trust me, about 10 years ago, texture seams were a pain because you did all of your textures by hand inside of Photoshop, and these texture seams could make it hard to match up detail across seams. So that's still pretty good, but we're running into too many seams. And remember the number of UV islands we have, 6. That can up the footprint inside of a game engine by increasing its vertex count. That's just behind the scenes number crunching stuff that a game engine does. But if we look at this example right here, it's very much similar to the example we see over here, but yet it's straight, nothing crooked. And the biggest difference is that I've cut seams on the corners of my box lid, as I use quotation marks. And now, since there's seams here, I can lay it out a little bit flatter. I don't have to worry about as many seams. If I wanted to draw that detail of the strap going from, say, over here where my mouse cursor is rolling up there, then boom, it's right here. It's all connected. I can do a little bit easier hand painting textures. And if we look at the checkerboard, we can see how these squares are just flowing really nicely across that edge. Yeah, we get a seam here, get a seam there on the corners, and of course one where the bottom and the top are. But it's probably the best of both worlds. It's a nice compromise. And that's really what UVing is all about. It's about making compromises to get the biggest UV islands you can with the least amount of distortion, while also really, as few UV seams and islands as possible as well. So it's one big juggling act. But if you keep following these topics, then you have some nice rules of thumb to follow, so you can start creating some good textures. The next concept I want to talk about is how UV borders and hard edges and 90-degree angles affect the way we lay out hard surface models. So I'm going to select the shotgun here. This is a good example of some organic curvature with the handle and the barrel meeting some hard surface, hard edge shapes. So if you look here, I went ahead and just packed this in half of the square. That way, if I wanted to put another gun texture on here, I have a whole nother half to do that. So it's more of an efficient way of laying out this shotgun. I can cut down on the number of materials in the engine. But if we look past that and just look at how the islands are laid out, you can see that there's a lot of just little islands here, like something like just this little guy floating here. I'm going to select it, and we're going to, well, if you'll notice, let me turn off the island highlighter. We'll go over these tools in a second. I just want you guys to start following the concepts for right now. If we select this, then we see that it's surrounded by severe 90-degree angles all the way around it. So a rule of thumb for normal map baking, it does not bake over 90-degree angles very easily. The only way you can get a normal map to bake that nice bevel that we create across a 90-degree angle, or more acute, is by creating a separate UV island. And anywhere where there's a 90-degree angle that you harden, that has to be a UV border. And we can see our borders by clicking on this visibility icon right here in our UV editor. We can see that the thick white lines denote a UV border, and we can see that small little areas like down here, we can see that white, let me get a better view of it, sorry. We can see that this white UV edge border around it signifies that, hey, this is a UV island, it's hardened, it's the only way I can get a good normal map to bake across these severe angles. So that's why something like the shotgun is broken up into multiple smaller islands. It doesn't look very optimized, and to be honest, it could probably use a few bevels here and there to reduce the number of islands we get here. Because remember, if we bevel a detail right here, we can bevel this edge with our bevel tool. I'm going to take it down real low. And now instead of a 90-degree angle, here, let me undo that so you can see it in action. Hit apply. And now we get two 45-degree angles instead of a 90-degree angle, and we can definitely UV map around that. So the rule of thumb, and it's not really a rule of thumb, it's just the law of the land. Anytime you have a 90-degree angle, it has to be on its own UV island. That means there's going to be seams that are going to be harder to texture with. That means there's going to be more UV islands to up the vertex count and the CPU footprint and the game engine and all that stuff. So it's another balancing act with hard surface stuff. And these days, game engines are able to handle more and more polys. So if this gun is something that a first-person character would use, we're going to see this really up close. Then this asset would probably say, okay, we can take a few hundred extra faces, maybe 1,000 extra faces, and bevel out this detail so that we're not left with having to create separate UV islands. On some areas, let's look at this area right here, where we have a detail that's supposed to run across this hard angle. But you can see as I was hand texturing this, they don't exactly perfectly line up, do they? That's because I had to draw over this seam right here. Okay? And if I want to bring up this image, Maya has a little, 2018 has a little bug. I'm going to show us how we can reload that stuff up in a second. But whenever I do get that loaded, I'll jump back there and talk about this specific detail. I want to save that for the tools section. So this little detail here was hard to draw across this seam. So beveling and that's just a way to kind of get around that, because then I don't have to separate that 90-degree hard edge into a separate UV island. All right. So let's talk about layout direction and basically how we can read detail on something like a hand painted model. How we can easily paint on a texture layout inside of something like Photoshop. So if we look at this cog sword, you'll notice a few things. The top of the blade is lighter than the base. This gives the idea that there's a point of light. It really makes details pop on a hand-painted surface. And to be honest, it was just a really easy gradient I had to draw inside of Photoshop to kind of get this effect where the base of the weapon receives less light, so it's darker, just because the sword's held upright for most of the time. So when I was laying out and packing my UV islands, I made sure that everything about this sword was easy to read, see. Notice how the hilt is kind of horizontal. It kind of pertains to the way it kind of lays right here. The handle's straight up and down. The blade is straight up and down. All that good stuff is just laid out, and it's got a great direction inside my UV map. So you sometimes when you're puzzling and packing all your UVs into a square, you definitely want to take into consideration, how easy is it to follow my UV islands. So whenever I'm texturing by hand, I'll know exactly what orientation and what island pertains to what part of the mesh. Very, very important whenever you're working with hand-painted textures to give it that cartoony feel that we see in a lot of popular games. So the next concept that we will always follow is that we've mentioned it before, but every texture, let's select this guy. Every texture will be a power of 2 whenever you take it into Photoshop or something like that. If we look at the actual PNG file for what this 2D texture is, we'll notice that the resolution is a power of 2, meaning anywhere from like 64 to 128 to 256 to 512 to 124 to 1024, 2048, 4096, so on and so forth. It's a weird numbers thing, math thing that game engines really like. It basically makes it just a little bit more optimized in the engine to run all these textures if they match up with the way bytes work. Remember, bytes are 8 bytes, 8 bits, all that stuff, powers of 2, even down to the Boolean level of the way computers work. We'll also make sure that our textures are packed in the 1-to-1 square. Remember, all these squares repeat into infinity here. All of them repeat to infinity. But wait, I kind of just broke my rule here. Well, if all of our textures need to be packed into this 1-to-1 square, then what's going on here? Well, that brings us to our next point, and we're going to talk about mirroring UVs to cut down on texture space. So let's look at this character real quick, okay? We can see that his front of his shirt is asymmetrical, meaning we have a bandolier starting up here, and the details on the left or right are different, right? This little cartoony character has a really, severe bandolier going on, holding his little cartoony computer. And there's no way to achieve this effect if the detail was mirrored from right to left, right? I mean, that needs to be its own island. But yet you'll also notice, if I point it out here, that the arms are totally mirrored, meaning they share the same UV space from one another. So if I select this whole UV shell right here, then both arms become selected. In fact, if I just select one, then I can see the matching brother over here to it, and it's basically using the same texture. We already said that these squares repeat to infinity. In fact, I can grab all of these parts, all these islands over here, and if I used one of the moving tools, let me just get these shells. If I could just select all these islands over here, then I will use my transform tool that we'll talk about in a second. Let's see. And I move them over. You can see that they line up exactly on top of other UV islands. So again, if I select both these shells, I select both arms, but if I select just one, you can see that they sit right on top of each other and they're mirrored for all intents and purposes. But yet, the chest is not mirrored. It's its own thing. Okay? So how can we achieve this effect in a quick little workflow? Well, I'm going to show us an example of how we can mirror. I'm going to separate these, and I'm just going to duplicate this chest piece, bring it out here, and I'm going to cut this arm off. Oops. You know what? I'm going to select this UV shell over here, and I'm going to select the faces. We're going to delete that guy's arm. All right. So, as I'm projecting, let me redo that. As I'm projecting this character, I will UV the front and back as if it was just one mesh that's not going to be duplicated here, right? So you can see I've already got these projected out and laid down. They both have left and right considered on the front and back. But I need to get this arm mirrored over and sharing the same textures as this. But yet, if I do a mirror duplication, Control D, my pivot point looks like it's in the right place. Let's bring up this channel box real quick. Normally it's over here. I'm going to put it right there. And we do a -1 in the X. But then we see I get all these extra faces over here. Never fear. I'm going to press H to hide that one, because all I need to do now is just delete out the chest right here. Get all those annoying chest pieces out. Display show all again. And now you can see that my hand still has the UVs exactly where the UVs were for this arm over here. And if I select both pieces now, boom, arms UVs are right there, arm UVs are right there. So when you mirror a model, the UVs are also kind of duplicated. So it keeps the same UVs as this arm. And I kind of deleted out the chest because I've already got that UV'd. Now all I have to do is go to Mesh, Combine, And yeah, I've already laid down these UVs, but I can still go in and merge some verts, right? I can still go in and merge those verts. And basically, that's how we can trick UV mirroring to work for us. Um, Typically, you definitely want to mirror as many UV islands as possible, but note, let's see what happens if I try to mirror the chest plate with the kind of detail I have drawn out. Let me get rid of those. This is what happens whenever you have a mirrored straight down the center. Let me go to modify center pivot. Let me delete that. Let me get my center pivot just where I need it, because a mirror makes it needs a good center pivot, because our pivot point dictates what it gets mirrored across from. So I press Control D, do the mirror duplication with a -1 scale. That's basically what we get, guys. See how the detail is literally just reflected? Not the very best for the bandolier design that we see right here. So that's why we have some parts and pieces of our model, over here a second ago, and now they're over here. I'm going to go ahead and reload this scene so we can see what it was like before I moved them over. And I'm definitely going to show us the tool on how this works. So you can definitely see that any duplicated island that we have that would normally lay right on top, right on top of these, we want to shift them over one unit, because the normal map baking process in Maya does not like it when islands are stacked on top of each other like this. It kind of overdraws or double draws the normal map bake. So any island that's duplicated needs to be shoved over. And there's a specific tool that does that in our UV toolkit. It's in our transform section. I'm going to go over this again. I want to just kind of reveal the magic real quick. We can shift by whole units. All right. So that's a little bit about mirroring our UVs. We definitely want to have UVs mirrored, because all these islands right here, if I didn't have this mirrored, the head, the shoulder plate, the legs, then we would have to find spots on this square for these to live in. And the only way to find room for those guys over here, our duplicated parts, is to shrink down the size of these islands to make more room. And then what do? We have less pixels dedicated to these islands, so the resolution gets a little bit lower. So by having our duplication set up just right, we can basically kind of only have to worry about giving half the face UV space in our 1-to-1 square, and we can increase the size of it and get more pixels on there. So that's how duplication can really save us a ton of pixels and get higher resolution textures on our model. The next thing we're going to talk about is UV island border padding. Basically, I'm going to go ahead and reload this texture. So the texture bug that we get, sometimes when you want to see the texture behind the model, you may have to, it's a bug in 2018, I'm pretty sure. We might have to go back to our hypershade and relink the texture, even though it's linked up because it's a project and everything's set up correctly. We sometimes have to go and relink it. So I'm going to click on this little arrow here, because the color map is what we need to relink so it shows up in my UV texture. And then we basically need to click on our folder and reselect the texture. And now it shows up for us, and we can turn that now on and off with our portrait frame up here. I need to turn that on to exhibit border padding right here. You can see the edges of my UV maps right here, right? Or my UV islands. But then you'll also see that I kind of overdrew the texture, by I don't know how many pixels. I think the standard is about 7 to 10, somewhere along there. Because whenever assets go into game engines, the way the math works behind the rendering engines, the farther a mesh gets away, the blurrier these texture edges get. And sometimes, it doesn't get a precise draw right here. and it kind of can sneak up into here. So if we give our texture some border, then it's not going to show a weird gray seam. Like if we see this example right here, let me go to where my skull is. It's not going to show a weird gray kind of seam right there, because that's what kind of happens in game engines. This line of exactly where the border edge is gets blurred, distorted, and we kind of get something like this going on. So the farther our meshes get away, the more undefined our borders get. So we get around that by adding a nice border pad and overdraw on our textures. So in regards to that, we need to make sure that when we're trying to place all of our UV islands in our square, they need room to breathe apart from one another. They need room for this border padding to really kind of do its own thing. So you don't want to pack your islands too close together. We took a shell like this and did something like that. That's definitely not going to fly, because then you're going to start seeing when the engine kind of blurs those border edges, when the asset gets far away, it starts doing something like this, and then we start seeing detail from that UV island right here. We definitely want to have edge border padding, and there are tools that allow you to kind of do that automatically, laying them out. But you'll also be placing a lot of your UV islands by hand, so it's something you definitely need to give consideration to. So give your island some room to breathe. UV atlasing is a term we use whenever we take. Let me bust this up. Whenever we have a model or an asset filled with a bunch of different parts and pieces, we don't want to create a separate material for each one of these floating pieces of geometry. We want this all to fit on one texture sheet. So if we select it, all the pieces together, we see that even though all these meshes are separate in their own thing, they only take up a little bit of our UV space right here. You may be wondering, how is this UV island layout so terrible? Well, with UV atlasing comes a powerful way of texturing and modeling certain types of assets, like environments, modular environments, like buildings. So I'm going to go back into my rendering editor, and let's reveal the texture for these spaceships real quickly. Again, this bug is annoying, but we're just going to reselect that texture. So if we bring back, that's my hypershade, I'll get rid of it for now. That's my channel box. If we bring back, now that I've done a little bit of cleanup, if we bring back the mesh on my UV editor right here and press the texture revealer, and I'm going to turn on the dimmer right here so we can actually see a little bit easier. We get this little, if you select this little portrait in the slider, you can dim it up a little bit to your heart's content. The way that this asset was actually made was the texture was created first. I went in and created these stock generic spaceship paneling and parts and pieces textures first. All right. And then I modeled and UV'd according to where and how the textures were laid out. So let me show you a quick little workflow on how that works. Now that we've kind of talked about how separate parts need to be atlas together on one texture sheet, why don't I show us why random parts and pieces are just showing up instead of taking advantage of this whole one-to-one space. Basically, you'll understand if I show you the method in which I modeled this. So I'm going to do a quick little UV and modeling experiment right here, or demonstration rather. I'm going to elongate this. We're going to make a little engine. It's going to be real basic, trust me. And I'm going to select this face, extrude it out, and scale it up a little bit. So real basic engine type shape. All right. I'm going to do some quick projections. I'm going to select my faces on the end. So I'm going to select it all and then deselect the middle. And that leaves me with the two edges out here. I'm going to do a quick automatic map for those faces right there. And I'm going to grab them and I'm going to shove them over here. And then, you know what? I'm going to grab all the rest of these faces. See, these are the rest of the faces that haven't been projected. And I'm going to go to Mesh, Edit Mesh, actually, and Extract. So now the front and back of the engine that I'm making are separate mesh from the round cylinder side, because I'm going to come in here and look at my top view. I'm going to come in here and delete it down the center. That way I can use some mirroring techniques. And then I'm going to come in and I'm only going to texture half of this guy. I'm going to come in and do a quick UV projection based on my camera. This is the shape that I get. I'm going to use my tools texture. Where is it? Tools. Show UV toolkit. I'm going to use my toolkit to unfold this little guy right here. So now I'm left with a nicely laid out cylinder side for my engine, and I got these two guys right here, and I'm ready now to match these UV islands according to the texture. So it's a little pretty crazy little workflow, but it's really helpful. You create your texture first. Right now I'm just applying that spaceship material and texture to my little engine. So it doesn't look good right now, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this UV shell right here. I'm going to make this a hatch on the front of the engine, so you can see I'm basically just matching up the UV island so it fits on this little hatch right here. I don't like the rotation of this, so I'm going to use my transform rotate button. There we go. My hatch is straight up and down now. I'm going to take my other little UV island here for the back of my engine, and notice how it's just picking up all this detail. Well, if I go in and scale it just right, you can see now I'm trying to get like a little turbine thing in the back. And now for the base, I can do something like this, and we're going to scale it down, and we're going to make sure that it kind of lines up okay. Right now it's just a combination of looking at the distortion of the model versus how it's lining up here. I don't exactly like some of the distortion that's going on right here, so I'm going to use some UV tools to darken this so I can see what's going on. I think I can straighten UVs. There we go. Straighten UVs. And what happens right there. And boom. Now that my UVs are a little bit straighter, I don't get the exact same kind of distortion. In fact, I'm going to scale this down. Oh, no, that looks okay. Because whenever I mirror duplicate it over, I'm going to have to make sure that these seams aren't too obvious. Like so. And it's really just a cool little workflow to get some fast models made with some generic textures. And here I am just snapping these in line with one another so these seams can look a little bit better, because it's hard to see now. Let me go ahead and duplicate this over so you can see exactly why I'm worried about it so much. So you can see we have some texture seams going on right here. So I want to make sure that my texture seams live within the actual seam of these panels so they match up better. And a little bit more work needs to be done, consider that, or maybe that's just a quick and dirty way to get a texture applied quickly to an asset where you made the texture sheet first and then modeled to it. And one of the last concept that we're going to look at is just the concept of UV puzzling. You've already seen me kind of just doing it by moving the UV islands around and demonstrating and talking about how we need to stay within this one-to-one square. UV puzzling is just the act of figuring out the best way to pack all your UV islands. And remember, we have several things to consider. We have our distortion to consider. So do we separate all of these UV islands like this and lay them out like that, or do we cut some seams, limit the number of islands we have? We have the Dota 2 model example where we want to give more texel density to the most visible parts of our model as the player sees them in the game. So for this Dota 2 character, Our head and our arms and our upper body need more pixels than our feet. That's our head. It's huge. That's our feet. It's really small. So we need to puzzle it out that way. And then we also have mirror duplication. We need to puzzle this out by like shifting these islands over one unit, um, while at the same time trying to keep as much mirror detail in there as possible and balancing that with asymmetrical detail. I mean, this chess piece could have been half the size, but we chose to give it an asymmetrical layout so you get that nice bandolier going. We also have in our puzzling to worry about our edge padding stuff that we were talking about earlier. So when you're puzzling it, it may be tempting just to pack these super close together because you don't want to waste any of this negative space. All of this space where nothing's drawn is just wasted pixels, inefficient. But that's still a pretty good pack right there. There's going to be wasted space no matter what, but when you're UV puzzling and arranging and laying them out, you want to limit all these things while keeping into account all all of the concepts that we just kind of went over. So it is kind of like a puzzle. That's why they call it UV puzzling. There's no correct way to lay something out. Every model is going to be different. So it's just something you kind of got to go with your gut with. And there are tools to get you started, but to be honest, I usually just start from scratch unless it's a super complex hard surface model that I'm going to take into something like Quixel, where uh, puzzling out all the islands on it may be a little time consuming. But we're only dealing with 20 or 30 islands right here, so that's not too crazy. That's something we can definitely take the time and consideration and do a nice professional layout for.